Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the GSMC SciFi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Keith, and welcome back to the podcast. Thank you again for joining me this week. I'm happy to have you here. This week we're going to be finishing up our discussion on virtual reality and moving into, well, I guess kind of a different topic. And it's not super different, but different enough that I can't really call this necessarily a part 2. I'd call it more like a part 2.5 because it's kind of half of a new subject. So we're going to be kind of re-going over a little bit of our examination of the handling of the idea of a self in science fiction, primarily through the lens of the idea behind virtual reality or the trope of virtual reality. And before we get kind of back into the heavy stuff, I want to do a weekly content suggestion at the top of the podcast this week. So firstly, I am currently reading a book series by Dan Simmons called The Hyperion Cantos. I'm only about 20 pages in. I know you're only 20 pages in. Why are you suggesting this? So far, it's really good. It is written in the style of the Canterbury Tales, and it's kind of like loosely based on the poems of the same name written by John Keats, who is an awesome poet. If you're not familiar with his work, you should familiarize yourself. He's really good. So, of course, the prose in the book are excellent, and the storytelling really takes center stage. You can already tell that it's going to be like really intense and immersive. Simmons doesn't waste any time on like the setting. He kind of just uses the characters and their interaction with the setting to like as a tool to get the audience engaged with the setting, which is really cool and like refreshing because that's just not your normal approach to science fiction settings. If you read Dune, it opens up with like this long diatribe of exposition about the setting. And really, how long can I read about a giant sand planet for? Hint, it's not that long. There's a reason Star Wars stays on Tatooine for only a brief amount of time. But despite the lack of exposition for the setting, he doesn't like leave the reader wanting for content regarding the setting. It's more that the setting is so fluidly interwoven with character development that you almost don't even notice that he's expounding on the details of the universe while getting the reader engaged with the characters. I imagine that I'll probably have a lot to say about the series because I am planning on reading the whole thing. And I'll probably give you guys a couple weeks in advance if I'm going to talk about it for an episode. So if you're interested in like the discussion on this topic and on the book, don't worry, I'll have a ton to say about it. And hopefully I can do so without too many spoilers so you can want to read the book rather than have to read the book. My second recommendation for this week is kind of like a little bit beyond the scope of what would be considered normal nerddom. It's an anime. So if you're like super nerd like me, you might be interested in it. Or if you're just interested in kind of like a different culture's take on entertainment, you might give it a shot. Or if you've ever thought like, anime seems cool, I might give it a try. This is a really good starter anime in my opinion. It's called No Gun Life or No Guns Life. It's done in a film noir style set in Japan several years after the end of a really large world war, during the war, individuals volunteered to have their bodies augmented via mechanical parts It centers around a character named Juzo Inui. He is an overextended, which means that like a larger portion of his human body has been replaced with mechanization, and he has a revolver for a head, which is like a really funny premise that they handle flawlessly, and it kind of virtually solicits no questioning from the viewer. At least from me, there was no questioning, so that was probably partially because I knew what I was getting into before I started watching it. But regardless, the setting is perfect for the content. The character development is absolutely impeccable, and the action scenes are really enjoyable. That's pretty standard with like a shonen anime. The first half of season 1 is currently available, and the second half comes out in April, and I'm actually really excited about it. I highly recommend you check this out, and again, I'm sure I will talk about it at some point, maybe even later in this podcast. I don't know. It's kind of along the same lines of what we're talking about today. So, getting into the bulk of the podcast, did I say the bulk of the podcast? I meant the bulk of the podcast. Just as a refresher, I'm going to be kind of briefly discussing what we defined virtual reality as last week and go over some of the conclusions that were drawn from that discussion. So think of it as like a rewrapped Christmas gift that you get to open again. So last week we defined virtual reality as such: a series of perceived realities that are forcibly stimulated within the mind to create memory or experience via non-concrete interactions, or memories that have been created via interactions with a world that only exists within the mind and not in tangible form. So connecting this to the idea of self is the concept that the self is actualized via our interactions and perceptions of the world around us, rather than something concrete that happens. It's our interpretation of something concrete that creates our idea of self and our idea of the world around us. Last week we talked a fair amount about the idea that our perception of reality is somewhat virtual, in the sense that it is projected by the self into the mind, where we can realize that it has been perceived, and at that point we interact with it. So that's kind of like last week I talked a little bit about the idea that René Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" isn't necessarily a flawless statement, and that there is like a little more expansion that's needed on that idea. The more proper way to phrase it that I would kind of advocate for is "I believe, I think, therefore I am." And the "I believe, I think" part is saying that I acknowledge that there is a self that filters the world prior to my knowledge of that world. So there is some sort of, extra mental, extra psychological thing that's happening there that I have no interaction with. It's kind of like how you breathe naturally, or like how your heart beats without you thinking about it having to beat. So the self is kind of a similar thing. It's an instinctual portion of the brain that we don't interact with that creates our perception of the world around us, which ultimately is our reality. So those ideas lend credence to the idea that the world we believe ourselves to know isn't actually real. It's more representative of a possible reality and not necessarily a 100% factual interpretation of what is really reality. So in a way, all realities are a form of virtual reality, in a sense, or in the sense that they are only perceived as being real because of an evolutionary investment that we as individuals have in our own realities being real. And that's part of why the idea of virtual reality is so fantastic and potentially horrifying. Because depending on your view of the human body and your ideas surrounding what creates a self, virtual reality isn't terribly far off from the world that we experience. Because we're basically experiencing kind of like the Plato's cave metaphor, where we have something that's actually happening behind us, and we're seeing the shadows of that thing that's happening behind us being cast on a wall in front of us. And the thing that's casting the shadows is the self, right? The self is the fire behind us that's basically putting the shadows on the wall because it's providing like light and understanding through some sort of subconscious interaction with the world. And then we believe those shadows to be true because they come from something that we don't interact with that is intrinsic to who we are, this self. And so we believe it to be true and act accordingly. And this is part of why virtual reality can be seen as horrifying, because I would argue that we as individuals, we're not really good at discerning what's real from what's synthetic, or like what's real from an experience that's been like projected in front of us rather than actually experienced. But that's kind of an entirely different topic that I'm not going to be tackling in this podcast. So we're going to kind of continue with a tiny bit of review and then get right back into the subject matter of this week and talk about one of the occurrences of this in the science fiction genre and kind of expand on that. But that'll be right after this commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back, everybody. So now that we've kind of rehashed what it was that we discussed in the last podcast, I want to get into some other really good examples of virtual reality in science fiction media. We left off talking about The Matrix last week, which is one of the more horrifying depictions of this idea. So let's talk about something a little bit more lighthearted. Well, at least most of the time. That being the episode of Rick and Morty with the video game, Roy, A Life Well Lived. First off, I want to say that Rick and Morty as an episodic-based show is really the perfect way to explore a number of really interesting science fiction tropes. The problem that's often run into in science fiction is that once the idea has been fully expounded upon, the material that comes afterwards seems kind of pithy because of the depth of the concept that's being wrestled with, which is why, like, quite often a lot of science fiction books or movies or TV shows don't go super far, because the main bulk of what makes the particular media interesting. So if it's a TV show, like I think Firefly is a good example of this, where like the premise and the setting of the show is like interesting, but once the premise has kind of been fully hashed out, we're left with just the character development, and it's kind of hard for people to get past the setting and just focus on the character development. I haven't seen Firefly in a super long time, so I'm not trying to say that it's bad or good or what have you. I'm just saying objectively, once the kind of like main premise of like, whoa, this is interesting, kind of goes away, then it's like, okay, well now we're just science fiction Western with some interesting character development. That's not going to necessarily hook people as much as the premise of like, oh, this person does this really interesting thing. So, back to Rick and Morty. That's the episodic approach, and like short stories are often the best medium for deeper and more complex philosophical ideas that are often found in science fiction for that reason, because you're just taking like a brief snapshot of like, here's this thing, now think about it, okay, we're done. It leaves you wanting for more, whereas sometimes when you keep going, people kind of get a little bit tired. And it's like, okay, well, I thought this idea was cool originally, but now I'm kind of done with it. So Rick and Morty does this really, really well. And not only that, but they're able to kind of like subtly slip in like social commentary and glaze over like incredibly heinous violations of our perception of morality via comedic mechanisms. And that really adds a lot to the show as a whole, which I think is pretty cool. So back to what I was kind of talking about originally. In the episode with the game Roy, A Life Well Lived, we witness the character of this game, a man named Roy, living out an abridged version of his life after Morty has a helmet in an arcade forcibly placed on his head by Rick. So the following story is a brief moment and perfectly executed exposition where we as the audience become rapidly invested in the life of this man without completely knowing the premise of why we are watching this story unfold. The game ends abruptly when Roy dies and the screen is filled with oversized and comical text reading "Game Over," and Morty is forced back to the arcade that he and Rick are currently enjoying. And it's at this point that we find out that Roy is an arcade game where your score is based on the longevity of the character, and Rick promptly tells Morty that he's going to beat his score, which I think was like 57 years, which isn't bad by any means, while Morty struggles with the fact that he feels that he has just led an entirely different life in a matter of moments, even going so far as to like ask where his wife is. So as soon as the helmet comes off, he starts being like, oh, where's this person and where's my wife and all that kind of stuff. And now they brush over this in classic Rick and Morty fashion. But I think that this is really a hilarious way to portray the potentials of virtual reality. Morty, for at least like a couple moments after the helmet comes off, believes that he truly lived an entire life as a man named Roy Parsons, which I'm pretty sure is a reference to something. Parsons usually is a reference to something. And ultimately, we aren't given the time to think about the implications there. So I'm kind of here to help you overthink your way through this little 2-minute side in a 20-minute cartoon show episode. Because what's crazy is they explore this like incredibly profound experience of like the entirety of a person's life, kind of like in the same way that Disney does with Up, where they show you in like 5 minutes and they get you super emotionally attached to the main character whose name is escaping me right now. Like they do a similar thing to that in this Rick and Morty episode, and I think it's just hilarious that like we don't even know what's happening as an audience. The helmet gets shoved on Morty's head, and then all of a sudden we're in a completely different world. And I don't know how the show creators do this, but they're just like, okay, we're here now, and like it starts out with Morty remembering that Rick shoved a helmet onto his head, but he's remembering it as Roy, who is starting out as a child. I think at like 4 or 5 years old is when the first memory forms, and the mom just says like, "Oh, it was just a nightmare. Don't worry about it." But he explicitly describes like, "I remember being in a room and a man shoved a helmet on my head." And so it's kind of like a little nod to the fact that like Morty is like kind of aware that he's in a simulation, but not totally. And it's funny because the amount of time that happens in the simulation is like obviously very abridged to the amount of time that's happening outside of the simulation. And this arcade day is kind of like being punctuated by some other horrible moral gray ground that Rick has gotten them into. So it's kind of like negligible, but I think that we should really talk about it more, which is why I'm here. So all jokes aside, I would argue that the self of Roy in the life that Morty experienced has been assimilated into the self of Morty. And this is where this brief bit becomes really interesting. Could virtual reality be used as a means to make someone believe that they are in fact a different person? I would argue that it can. And all without the loss of the original self. And so what do I mean by that? Right. So I'm going to use some examples from different thinkers, right? So in an essay by a gentleman named Derek Parfit, who is an excellent philosopher, you should check him out. The essay is titled On What Matters. He explores this idea on what components are truly important to the idea of self. It's essentially a long-form science fiction-based essay examining the problem of Theseus's ship. So Theseus's ship is a classical philosophical problem or conundrum, I think is the right way to phrase it. Basically, it asks, if a ship in a harbor sits in that harbor and begins to rot, how many parts of the ship can be replaced before it becomes a new ship and is no longer considered to be the original ship? And that seems kind of simplistic, right? But it actually has some pretty far-reaching implications in regard to us as human beings. But that all depends on what your ideas surrounding what constitutes the self are, right? If you believe the self to be intrinsically tied to the biological form of the self, then as soon as you replace any biological part with another, you've created a new self. But if you believe that the self exists entirely in the mind, then there is only one vital component that can be replaced that would solicit concrete change of the self. And so what this kind of is trying to get you to think about is what is the essence of a thing? Is the ship still the original ship because it is representative of the original ship, even if all the parts are replaced? Is it a new ship that is representative of the old ship? Is it just a new ship because it doesn't have any of the original parts? And what parts of the ship, if you would say that it becomes a new ship, at what point is it a new ship? When every part has been replaced? Or if the example were to say, well, they only replaced the exterior parts. Is it a new ship if they only replaced the exterior parts? What parts are most vital? So I'll give you my opinion in just a minute after this quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello and welcome back. I don't know why I said hello again, but welcome back. So, right before the break, we were talking about the essay, It's What Matters by Derek Parfit, and the idea of the problem of Theseus's ship. So, I personally would say, when it comes to the argument of Theseus' ship, or the argument of what constitutes the self as a human being, I would kind of fall into the category where I would argue that the self is firmly entrenched within the confines of the mind. And so long as that mind exists in some capacity, the self remains the original self and cannot become a new self. It simply assimilates the new components of its biological, or in Morty's case, the digital components of its environment. So Morty, in his belief that he experienced his life, has not, or experienced the life of Roy, just to be specific, has not altered him from his original self. He has assimilated or acquired the experience of an alternative version of his original self via this seemingly benign video game. And so what does that mean when it comes to the problem of Theseus' ship? Well, I'm not talking about the idea of a mind in a biological sense. I'm talking about the idea of a mind in a sort of data sense. So if we could upload, and I'm sure that there are science fiction novels about this, if we could upload ourselves into a virtual world, then I would say that the original self still exists. It's not like you become a new person. So if I could upload every aspect of my experience, every single memory I've ever had to a T, that's a qualifier there, to a T into a virtual world, and then continue to interact virtually via that stored consciousness and acquire new memories, new experiences via that stored consciousness, then I would say that myself still exists in some form. So in regards to the ship argument, I would say that once all of the parts have been replaced, that it's still the same ship that's in the harbor because it is representative of the same ship. So the essence of that ship hasn't been violated because it's being replaced with parts that are exactly the same. Now, if the parts are not exactly the same, so if it's like, let's say it's an old-fashioned ship, like it's a galleon from Roman times, right? Theseus, it's a Greek or Roman thing, I can't remember exactly. But if it's being replaced by like a different wood, so let's say you use like pine one time and birch another. I don't even know if they use those woods to make ships. I'm just giving examples of trees that I can name off the top of my head. So if you were to use pine for the original ship and it gets replaced with birch, well, that's like my consciousness getting uploaded and having one of my memories slightly altered. So I don't think that would constitute the same self. I think now that is a new self because you've altered the thing that makes a self, which is all of the experiences that have been assimilated into that self and the way that self projects thought into the mind of an individual. So if the self is contained entirely in the mind, as I have argued, then what are the implications of like synthetic or imitation minds? And this is where we're going to kind of enter into a new discussion on a different topic. And that topic is going to be Blade Runner, which, amazing film. I haven't seen the most recent edition or the Blade Runner 2049. And I know a lot of people will be upset because I've been told that it is better than the original. But as far as I'm concerned, the original is an incredible film. I know that it was mired in like production hassles and release hassles, and there's like 7 different cuts. I personally believe that the theatrical cut is the one that I like the best. I can't remember off the top of my head. They're all pretty good. I think that as kind of like a cult classic, it's really hard to beat that one. But as far as I know, the subject matter of Blade Runner 2049 is very similar to the subject matter of the original, and it kind of calls into question the sentient capabilities of programmed or synthetic minds to actualize the idea of a self. So the original Blade Runner focuses pretty heavily on the ideas of authenticity, with the black market economy being driven primarily by the trading of exotic animals. And the value of these animals and the food stocks created from those animals is based on their authenticity. So it costs more to buy, like I think one of the examples is a snake. A salesman tries to convince Harrison Ford to buy like a snake and says like, oh, it's a real one. But like they've been cloning animals for so long that it's almost impossible to tell what's real and what's not. But you can charge more for one that's real, quote unquote, and not cloned. And you can do the same thing, I think, for food. I think he goes to a restaurant and they say like made from real cow, not cloned cow, that type of thing. So they really examine this idea of like what is the value of something being real and not made in a lab. And this kind of foreshadows the more substantial problem that we're going to run into when we run into the idea of replicants. Replicants are a line of semi-sentient android/robots that have been created to serve humans, but they have a substantial enough AI capacity to have developed some kind of experience of the world that is similar to the human experience of it. And so why is this relevant to like what we're discussing? Well, if I'm arguing that the self exists within the confines of a mind, right? That there is a mind that has a self essence, right? that is created via connections in our brain that we are unaware of, if we are going to further reduce that self exists within the confines of a mind and not in essence, then it could be implied that I'm arguing that the self is developed or exists in an electrical capacity. Because when you're reducing brain function to the physical, as in like physics, and psychological and physiological interactions that create the concept of thought, you would in part be able to conclude that brain function is the conduction of electrical impulses across dense layers of nerve tissue. And if you conclude that such is the case, then it could further be concluded that were the ability to create synthetic brain function to be developed, the thought that would come from that technology would not be all that different from the thought that we experience as individuals. So by that logic, there is some point at which humanity can be imitated by machine. And this is referred to in a lot of different science fiction series. I believe it's called the Singularity in the Terminator series, just as an example. And this concept is usually explored in such a way that makes it seem really horrifying. Because as machines can have all the capacities of human thought, they can occupy bodies that are like sturdier or designed with more specificity in mind, like as a weapon or a servant. So when the replicants develop like a form of sentience because somebody's been doing like illegal experiments with their AI, they turn on their masters. And we can see that portrayed in a lot of like the kind of hyperviolence that happens in the original Blade Runner, where the replicants start murdering their masters. And that's part of the reason why Harrison Ford has gotten involved in this conflict that he's involved in throughout the movie in the first place. And then, of course, you also get like the opposite side of that, where now that they have emotions, they can potentially experience something like love. So I don't know if I want to call this a spoiler or not. Just in case you haven't seen the movie, you should definitely still watch it. I don't think that this ruins the movie by any means, but there is some implication at the end of the movie via like a particular interactions that you're unsure of whether or not the person that Harrison Ford is interacting with is a real person or a replicant. And if they are a replicant, how far off are they from being a real person? Which I think is just really interesting. And so another film that kind of does this in a much more lighthearted way is a film starring Robin Williams called The Bicentennial Man. And we will get into that right after this quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the Sci-Fi podcast. Just in case you forgot, my name's Keith. I've been hosting this for you for the last about half an hour. Thank you for listening. So right before the break, we were about to get into the film that I was kind of saying has a more benign or like lighthearted exploration of the idea of whether or not robots or synthetic minds can be considered to be human. The movie is called The Bicentennial Man, and it stars Robin Williams, who plays a robot that through upgrades, and I say upgrades in quotes, both cosmetically and in his circuitry, and then when you add in time, he is able to develop and advocate for his sentience. The film kind of asks a similar question to Blade Runner, which, as an aside, I should mention, Blade Runner is actually based on a Philip K. Dick story. So just in case you were wondering, is Philip K. Dick a good writer? Why did Keith say that it's a tragedy that he hasn't talked about any of his stuff prior to this? Yes, he has a lot of really good concepts. I think that there's a reason that we have multiple movies that are based off of an idea that he had and not actually a screenplay about or written in a more similar fashion to what he wrote. There's a reason that we just base things off of what he wrote. So he definitely had like good concepts, but his execution isn't necessarily all that great. But the film kind of asks a similar question to Blade Runner, and like iRobot's another example of this, but it's a much more benign kind of way. And ultimately it kind of comes to a different conclusion where it's not that thought dictates humanity, but the ability to die dictates humanity, which is a really interesting way to examine what it means to be human. And the reason I say that is because if thought is ultimately reducible to electronic interaction between nerve tissue, then that interaction can be synthesized. And we see a microscopic portion of that every time we use a computer. Like, we don't think of it this way, but a computer is basically imitating human thought using transistors and computer chips, and I don't know how computers work all that well. I'm not super well versed in that. My nerddom does not breach that particular area, but it breaches lots of other areas, I promise. But we see like a microscopic version of this every time we use a computer. Like, me recording onto this computer is essentially me recording onto a synthetic brain with nowhere near the level of functionality that a human brain can have. But the more and more that we develop computers, the more or the closer we get to actually being in or living in a world where computers can do things that only people should be able to do. And we see this, I think Boston Dynamics is the name of the lab, where they're kind of trying to develop robots that have an AI that can remember things that aren't pre-programmed. So they're pre-programming the idea of memory, and somehow that computer is able to like impart a memory into its programming and adapt accordingly, which is, I mean, it's kind of terrifying to watch the experiments that they do, just because the robots look so funky. But it's also super, super interesting because I'm just really curious how they're synthesizing that interaction, which is like a really complex interaction within the human mind. So to build it synthetically is pretty impressive. But all that to say, if the standard of humanity is that we have thought and memory, right, then we need to find a new defining aspect of what makes humanity human or special. And we really do. We kind of have a vested interest in this particular thing. So I think it's really funny that when the writers of this film decide that the ability to die is what defines humanity, I think it's ultimately kind of ironic or sardonic, because death isn't that much more unique of a phenomena than thought is if we're getting down to reducing something to its most basic form. So we're kind of left with this question. What really makes humans human? Is it experience? If so, then what is it that makes experience concrete and different from virtual reality? See, that's the tie-in right there. Not that I had to point it out to you. I literally use the keywords. It's like when they say the title of a movie in a movie. You know, shout out James Bond movies, I guess. So what makes experience different or more concrete than virtual reality? Because virtual reality is, or our reality around us is perceived as being concrete, though it's not really. It's more representative of the thing that we're experiencing rather than the actual thing. If I trip and fall, it's not that I've actually tripped and fallen over something. When I remember tripping and falling, I'm not doing the act of tripping and falling. I am perceiving the act of tripping and falling. It is a representation of the thing that occurred to me. And I think that there is a self that interprets that and then projects it into our mind, where we kind of like draw conclusions about it that further cause more subconscious things from the self to arise and further refines the self. So really then, like, virtual reality ought to be considered just as concrete as actual reality, which is kind of terrifying in itself, because virtual reality can be pretty easily manipulated via like a series of codes and programming or whatever system it is that virtual reality is kind of happening in, which is scary. But back to the topic at hand. So like, what makes humans human, right? If it's not experience, if it's not the phenomenon of thought, then like, is it death? I'm not totally sure. And if all these things can be synthesized, or like if we can have control over all of them, then how unique is it really? And then where are we left if it's not unique? And I think that that's like, those are the type of questions that are brought up by great science fiction stories. And those are the questions that we should really wrestle with to further our understanding of ourselves, the world around us, and to help us refine our love for the genre of science fiction. Because science fiction can kind of give us a place where it's not as threatening to look at, well, what makes me me? Or what is it about the world around me that's actually real, right? I can kind of question things and empathize with these complex ideas that are representative of something that's happening within me, either consciously or subconsciously. So I think that science fiction is a really great medium for that. And kind of on that note, I wanted to give you guys a little preview of the subject matter that I really want to tackle next week and suggest some reading for it accordingly. So if you're into that, here's kind of like a preview, like a soft preview of what we're going to talk about next week. So in the past few years, comic books, science fiction, and fantasy, they've all kind of become the target of some pretty negative press, often from like older generations or psychologists. And it's not that this is a new concept by any means. Like, the idea of having something that younger people enjoy be criticized by people of a previous generation is something that like our parents dealt with when they found things that they liked that were different than what the generation before them liked. Like, the generations have an evolutionary prerogative to make sure that they stay relevant, because if they're no longer relevant, then we won't like take care of them or think of them as having value. So they have an evolutionary investment in maintaining their value. And the best way and easiest way to do that is to critique the things that the generation after them does, so that they can say like, oh, well, we had access to this knowledge that makes us better or gives us a better life, and so you should listen to us and like help us maintain our existence. So that's been happening for a long time. I mean, since the beginning of time. There are quotes from Plato that say like, this new generation is so lazy and they don't take responsibility for anything and they're going to destroy the world. Like, and that's from Plato. And we've been hearing that about like millennials for years, unfortunately. So next week we're going to be discussing kind of like the idea of escapism and the value of science fiction, and why science fiction is a form, like it's viable as a form of higher literature or like high cinema. And when I say high, I just mean like worthy of critical acclaim and a valid place to examine deep and meaningful conundrums that we experience in our everyday lives. So I just kind of am going to argue that it's not simply a form of escapist literature that should be relegated to the young adult section at a used bookstores. At used bookstores, not at a used bookstores. I know how to speak the English, right? So I'm going to put the descriptions for some links to I'm going to put in the description some links to the articles that I'm going to be reading / providing a rebuttal for. So if you're interested in kind of like following along and knowing exactly what I'm talking about rather than just kind of like the general idea, because don't worry, I'll do a little brief summary and make it easy for everybody to follow along. But if you're interested in kind of being on the exact same page as me, I will put those links in the show notes. So, look forward to that. So that's all I've got for you guys this week. I really appreciate you joining me and kind of like finishing out this discussion on virtual reality and synthetic thought. If you like the podcast, make sure you click that subscribe button, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a good review as well. And I think that's about it. So thanks for joining me this week, guys. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.